There we go. Perfect. Um, Thank you so much. I should also say I didn't know those members of the community, but I would also pay my respects, and that was a lovely tribute. It seems like a very lovely community that you all have here. So thank you for inviting me. I'm very, very excited to have the opportunity to talk to you all tonight. I'm just going to share my screen and share a PowerPoint. So just going to very quickly turn on a little timer so I can keep track of how I'm going. I think I'm all ready. If anyone can't hear me or see anything, please let me know and I will fix it up. But otherwise, I might just dive into it. So tonight I'm going to talk to you all about a topic that is probably relatively well known or quite well known to a lot of people living in England or in the British Isles more broadly, and that is slavery and the abolition of slavery, specifically in Britain in the 19th century. I'm a historian of the Atlantic world, which means I study both, I say the Atlantic world, unfortunately not the whole Atlantic world, but the United States and England are my two main areas of focus of the anti-slavery movement. Um, oh, I was just looking at the the chat. Thank you for the welcomes. Um, but yes, sorry. So my work focuses on the United States and the United Kingdom, and I focus more so on anti-slavery and abolitionism as a movement. And so that's what I'm going to talk about tonight. I'm going to talk about the intersection of American abolitionists and anti-slavery in Britain. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to very quickly give a quick overview of the abolition of slavery in Britain. I apologize if this is familiar territory to a lot of you. I know it probably will be. Abolition is quite a point of pride in Britain and quite well known, especially there was recently a commemoration, sort of 200 years since the abolition of the slave trade, about, oh God, it was a while ago now, almost 20 years ago. There was a lot of sort of public discourse and that sort of thing. But if you don't know too much about it, I will just quickly give a bit of an overview so that the rest of my talk tonight makes sense. And I'm sorry, I've just got my notes on my phone because I'm traveling and they are holding up against a bottle. So I'm just looking over here to have some of my notes ready. But the main thing that you need to know when learning about the abolition of slavery in Britain is that it occurs in two different parts. So there's a first stage and there is a second stage. So the first stage is probably actually the most well-known one. What you think of is probably the 1807 abolition of the slave trade when you think about the abolition of slavery in Britain. And it's important to note that this is a massive, like monumental achievement, I guess, of the anti-slavery movement. But it's not the abolition of slavery entirely in the British Empire. It's just the abolition of the slave trade, which of course was a massive, massive component of the entire institution. But just a couple of things to note when this is happening and what it looks like. So, the abolition of the slave trade with the Slave Trade Act happens in 1807, or it comes into effect in 1808. But you really have about 30 or 40 years prior to that of a new kind of movement against slavery that is slowly formalizing in ways that it hasn't really before. So slavery has always existed, right, since the Roman Empire. And people have probably always been against that, but never in that sort of organized, formal way. So there's a different kind of movement happening here. And that is really exemplified by the creation of this society here, It's a small society at the beginning, but it's an important one. The Society for Effecting the Abolition of the Slave Trade. This is formed in London by a heavily Quaker dominated group, but also some other denominations as well. Something else that really pushes this first stage of the abolition movement is what's known as the Somerset case. And so this occurs in 1777. There is an enslaved person who is brought to England from the United States, and his owner tries to take him back to the United States, and he actually pushes back against this. And the judge, a judge named Judge Mansfield, he actually rules that it's unlawful for a person who's been enslaved elsewhere. It's unlawful for them to be sent back into slavery from England. And so basically, the judge didn't mean for this to become a massive kind of anti-slavery ruling, but technically, he's sort of saying England is a free place, right? You can't be enslaved in England. We know that the majority of slavery occurs elsewhere, in the Caribbean, for example, most prolifically, and in the United States, or what was the American colonies at that point. But basically, there's this new kind of push where people latch onto this ruling and sort of think, oh, okay, you're saying that slavery is this bad thing and that actually slavery can't happen on English soil. What does that mean for the rest of the British Empire? So that sort of pushes some of those early abolitionists into action. And that is also accompanied by massive petitions. Hundreds of thousands of people in the late 18th century are signing petitions. A lot of this work is being done by a man named Thomas Clarkson. You guys might know of him. I'll speak about him a little bit more in a second. All of this popular agitation leads in 1807 to the passing of the Slave Trade Act, which again is banning the trade of enslaved people throughout the British Empire, not slavery as an institution itself. Something interesting to think about in comparison is that the United States, at the same time, actually abolish their international involvement in the international slave trade. But the difference is that banning of the slave trade in the United States is actually embedded in their constitution from 20 years prior. This English decision is the result of mass popular agitation. So it's a very different set of circumstances, but it leads to both countries abolishing their participation in the international slave trade. But of course, that's sort of just the first step to total abolition. And so the second part of the story, after a couple of quiet years, there's this win in 1807, 1810s, a little bit quiet in terms of formal abolitionism. But then it starts to gain more traction again. There's a new generation, perhaps, of abolitionists. They form in 1823 this new society. They love having very, very long names. The Society for the Mitigation and Gradual Abolition of Slavery throughout the British Dominions, also known as the Anti-Slavery Society, is established in 1823. And this society pushes, again, this kind of popular agitation against slavery for lots of different reasons that I'll talk about in a second. But basically, a lot of public pressure, again, forces the Parliament to pass an act. This one is the Slavery Abolition Act in 1833. And what this does is free enslaved people in the British Empire. So not just the slave trade, but slavery itself. However, there is a caveat to that. And this is the fact that this is a gradual emancipation process, not an immediate process. So it's effective August 1st, 1834, but it doesn't actually, it doesn't occur straight away. Instead, what comes into being is what's known as the apprenticeship scheme. And so basically, this means that enslaved people were still bound to work for their masters for a certain amount of hours per day for a certain amount of years before they would be freed. There was a lot of backlash against this, and eventually it comes to an end a few years earlier than planned. So by 1838, you see total emancipation throughout the British Empire. Another thing to note that's important as a part of this story of British abolitionism is the massive amount of money that was spent by the British government to compensate the slave owners, not the enslaved people, but of course, thinking back to 19th century, they are compensating what they believe was a loss of property for these for these slave owners. And that is a massive amount of money that I'm pretty sure the government only finished paying off, or the taxpayers only finished paying off about 10 years ago. Um, and yeah, of course, it's an interesting question that I debate with my students in my history of slavery class. You know, this idea of compensation, of course, was paid to the slave owners, but you might have heard some discussions in the current day about compensation to people whose family members were enslaved and kind of this reparations discussion. But of course, it's so layered and complex, sort of like how do you make up for slavery? But that is what's going on in Britain. Just to kind of situate where we are in terms of other countries abolishing slavery and a bit of a timeline. As I said before, the US abolishes their participation in the slave trade in 1808, but it's not until the US Civil War, so a significant amount of time later than Britain, that the US will abolish slavery, so 1865. So people say Britain is the first to abolish slavery. They technically are, but it depends which one we're talking about. So in 1794, slavery is abolished in the French colonies after what's known as the Haitian slave revolts uprising. However, Napoleon quickly comes back into power or comes to power and reinstates slavery. We also have in 1803 the abolition of the slave trade in Denmark. Then we have in 1848 the second abolition of slavery in France. And then to push it all the way back to the last place to abolish slavery is Brazil in 1888. So important thing to take away is that England is a very early mover in this anti-slavery movement in terms of the globe. And that's going to make them a really important place for other abolitionists coming from different places, which is going to be the focus of the second half of this talk. So just quickly, because we really don't have an exact answer to this question, but why do they do it? If slavery is something that has been a part of human society since ancient Rome, as I mentioned before, what changes? What makes it something that has become a societal ill and evil? And so scholars have posited many different reasons for why Britain decides to abolish slavery. In the United States, on the other hand, we see a massive bloody civil war leads to the decision to emancipate enslaved people. But that's not the case in Britain. There's not that sort of massive event or something. It's sort of, you can't sort of generalize to the extent to say it sort of comes out of nowhere, but in some ways that is kind of what it feels like. And so one of the reasons is that scholars have posited is to do with religion. This kind of evangelical push throughout the Atlantic world in the late 18th, early 19th century, a newfound recognition of slavery as a sin, a push for personal salvation, needing to rid yourself and your society and your community of sin. This is a very popular explanation in kind of the first phase of scholarship on the anti-slavery movement. Very much this idea of abolitionism as natural, inevitable, the result of moral progress in England. They see abolitionists like Wilberforce and Clarkson as selfless and virtuous. Um, and that's not to say that they aren't, but they're just sort of highlighting, the role of evangelicals in pushing for the abolition of slavery. The second potential explanation, and what, usually is the reason things happen in society, often, of course, is to do with money. So some scholars would suggest that Britain decided to abolish slavery because they realized that it was no longer profitable. There's this sort of ongoing debate, what's more profitable, enslaved labor versus free labor. But some historians pushed back and suggested that no, actually, if you look at these numbers, look at this data, one historian in particular, Seymour Drescher, of who does a lot of work on British slavery, push back and say, no, actually, it was a profitable situation. So that's not really a good explanation for what's going on. The last thing, and where we are probably now as historians would say this is, perhaps a little bit more of a convincing argument, but myself, I'm not sure there's ever any one thing you can pinpoint for a situation like this. I'm sure it's a variety of different factors, timing, people. But I think the cultural and social factors are definitely what historians are paying the most attention to at the moment. And so there are a couple of different parts to this reason. The first being the loss of the American colonies. So I'm sure you all know the American colonies are part of the British Empire. They revolt, Declaration of Independence, Revolutionary War, and they are expected to lose to the mighty British Empire. They have less men, less power, but they win. They succeed and they successfully break off from the British Empire. And so some scholars see this as a sort of crisis in British imperialism. And so I'm just really going to quickly read out this quote from a great scholar named Christopher Brown. And he's a real proponent of this idea that that massive loss of faith almost in British imperialism, because of this loss of the American colonies, is a big reason behind why they decide to abolish slavery. And so Christopher Brown says, quote, "The British abolition movement that began in the 1780s did not follow inevitably from enlightened sensibilities, social change, or a shift in economic interests. The campaign, however, had its roots in a distinct and distinctive moment in British imperial history, a moment that presented both unfamiliar challenges and novel possibilities to those preoccupied with the character and consequences of overseas enterprise." So basically, Christopher Brown is suggesting that there's this crisis in British imperialism, and abolitionists kind of take hold of that uncertainty and push this through. The other part of this equation, the more cultural, social part of the question, is slave revolts, enslaved people revolting against their conditions all throughout the British Empire. And of course, it's not just specific to the British Empire, but there are a few particular events that really rock kind of this idea of slavery being a good thing, an economically profitable thing. We have Taki's rebellion in Jamaica in 1760. We have the Haitian Revolution, which of course is taking place not in the British Empire, but it is a successful, massive enslaved revolt in the French Empire that sort of, that news spreads very quickly and makes people nervous. These stories of violence, against the white enslavers. There is a rebellion as well in Jamaica, which was really one of the biggest, most profitable islands in the British Empire in terms of plantation labor. So some scholars suggest that it's this real big fear of enslaved rebellion. And that then comes sort of into the question again of economic costs, because, how do you keep a group of people subdued, having to have revolts and the destruction of infrastructure and having to fix things and having to have weapons and that sort of thing. Anyway, a long story short is sort of you can't potentially pinpoint one thing. Um, Historians at the moment are focused more, as I said, on the cultural, social kind of elements of it all, but I'm sure that will sway again back, as it always does. Just quickly, before I get into the more transatlantic side of things, I just want to quickly highlight a couple of key kind of players in this anti-slavery movement, particularly in Britain. And so I'm sure most of you have probably heard of William Wilberforce and Thomas Clarkson. So I'm not going to spend too much time on them because I'm going to make a point of suggesting that these two men are very important. There's absolutely no doubt about it in the abolition of slavery in the British Empire. William Wilberforce more so in the Parliament, whereas Thomas Clarkson is more so out, mobilizing the public in a more kind of ground level way. But I just wanted to highlight a couple of other people who are representative of different groups of people that really made abolition possible in Britain. And so the first is Black abolitionists. And these were both enslaved, as per my point just before about enslaved revolts, but also free Black abolitionists, like these men here on the screen. So on the left, we have Aloda Equiano, and he is enslaved originally. He is taken to the Caribbean, taken from his home in West Africa, taken to the Caribbean, enslaved. But eventually, he is actually able to purchase his own freedom, and he moves to London and becomes involved in the abolition movement there. And in 1789, he is publishing his autobiography, which you can see sort of the front of here. This is a huge bestseller, and enslaved people's narratives or autobiographies will become a massive, what's the word I'm looking for, genre of books in this era that are really popular. Kind of a very similar situation on the right-hand side is a man named Ottobah Cugoano. He was born in what is now Ghana in Africa and sold into slavery and taken to Grenada, which is the British West Indies. Slightly different story though. He doesn't purchase his freedom. He's actually freed as a result of that Somerset ruling that I mentioned just before. And he again publishes a narrative just like Equiano. They have some very good titles in the 18th century. His is called Thoughts and Sentiments on on the evil and wicked traffic of slavery and commerce of the human species. So gives you a pretty good idea about what's inside. But just to quickly note that formerly enslaved people such as Equiano and Cugoano are really important to the movement because they could provide this first-hand testimony about the horrors of slavery. Their books were bestsellers. They undertook book tours. They were really key in boosting public support for abolition in Britain. And I think it's really important to note as well, because there's a big difference between England and the United States, or Britain and the United States, when it comes to slavery. Slavery happens in the American South. People see it, and of course, if you're in the North, not so much. But in Britain, it's kind of out of sight, out of mind. This is taking place in the colonies that most people will never go to. So these narratives are really important to have people understand what it's actually like. And then we have women. Um, of course, it's not anything crazy to suggest that women are involved in reform movements, but it is an important thing to highlight just how important they were to the anti-slavery movement, particularly the second phase in Britain, that kind of 1820s, 1830s push for the abolition of slavery itself. So they are not allowed to join male anti-slavery societies. There is a gender disparity when it comes to, again, American and British abolitionism. In America, there are more mixed sex organizations. In England, they are kept separate. So you have female anti-slavery societies, often working in conjunction with male anti-slavery societies. Women do a lot of this day-to-day work, like organizing pamphlets, organizing petitions. They also are really big advocates of boycotting slave labor. So early sort of, ethical consumption, making sure that the things they're purchasing for their household are not made of enslaved labor. And just to pinpoint one woman in particular who's really important, on the left-hand side, Elizabeth Hayrick. She is an early abolitionist, and she is really well known for a pamphlet that she writes in 1824. As I mentioned before, British abolitionism is a gradual process. There's a debate going on at this point in time. If we abolish slavery, and if we do it immediately, will that pose a danger, quote unquote, to the white population? Or do we need to kind of gradually ease into it? She was a proponent of this form of immediate emancipation. And so she publishes this pamphlet and suggests that immediate emancipation is safe. And in terms of the transatlantic dimension to this story, makes a really big splash and really influences some American abolitionists to take a similar stance. On the right-hand side, very quickly before I get into it, the more transatlantic story is a man named George Thompson. I would be very interested actually to know if anyone has heard of him before. He is a massive, massive anti-slavery figure in the Atlantic world. He is very, very famous in the United States. He travels to the United States multiple times, undertakes years-long lecture tours. In England, he's a member of Parliament only for a few years for Tower Hamlets. But the reason that he's not as well known as Wilberforce and Clarkson is because he actually comes to prominence post 1833. So they have abolished slavery, and he has his moment kind of after that. And so one of the points I make, or I made in my PhD thesis, is that George Thompson is really well known in the transatlantic space, right? Not so much in the British national context like Wilberforce and Clarkson. He's much well more known in the transatlantic sphere. And so that leads us very quickly to a quick overview of transatlantic abolitionism. So again, here I am mostly talking about the United States and the United Kingdom. And we try not to be too reductive when we do this distinction, but it really is one of those things that people did make this distinction in this time about whether or not they were a follower of this one man or not, to distinguish themselves in terms of what type of abolitionist they were. And so this man on the left here is William Lloyd Garrison. He is the most famous abolitionist in the United States. So you may have heard of him before, or maybe not. But basically, to understand the couple of case studies I'm going to talk about in a minute, it's important to understand that the anti-slavery movement of the 19th century was in no way cohesive. It can be broadly organized, and I say, broadly, very generally, into two categories. And so you might think, in today's world, the social issues that people are pushing for, usually people have different ideas about how to accomplish those goals, to how to reform society. And this is no different. So William Lloyd Garrison and his followers, they are strictly pacifists, so non-violent. They are critical of the churches, They think that the churches are not doing enough to push against slave owners. They also refuse to engage in politics. So their approach to abolitionism is we need to change public opinion. We need to change people's minds. And we're not going to use violence, we're not going to use politics, etc., etc. And they are supportive of women's full involvement in abolitionism. So this is an important part of the question because, someone like William Wilberforce, who is a big British hero, doesn't actually really support women's involvement to a certain extent in the anti-slavery movement. Perhaps it's fine if they want to go and get a petition or do this and that, but there's very much that gendered sphere of the 19th century where some abolitionists thought that women should stay home and kind of do those things they can do from home or in their neighborhood, but leave the big stages to the men. On the other side of the equation, we have people who we call non-garrisons in the sense that they kind of were opposed to his views on how to bring about the abolition of slavery. I am skipping a little bit quickly through these organizational parts here because I have realized that they're not actually that important based on what I've changed my talk to be. So don't worry too much about those. Just focus on the fact that the non-Garrisonians are happy to engage in politics. They're happy to, use the ballot to try to achieve their goals. They're less critical of churches, broadly speaking, and they are usually more critical of women's involvement. So this is actually what causes this massive rupture in the abolitionist movement in 1840 is the question of women's involvement. And so you get this split, Garrisonian, non-Garrisonian. And that split in the United States context also makes its way across to the British context as well. And so finally, I get into some of the interesting detail. I've got about 15 minutes left. And so what I'm going to do is very quickly go through 3 case studies. And by very quickly, I mean the first 2 I'm going to go through relatively quickly. I've got Frederick Douglass, a man whose name is probably quite familiar, another woman, and then sorry, oh my gosh, I feel like I'm still jet lagged. Lastly, I have a man named Samuel Ward, who I want to dedicate quite a bit of time to because I think he really speaks to some of the tensions and the interesting nuances of this transatlantic abolitionist world when he's in Britain. But anyway, just to introduce a man who, as I said before, you may know. You might also know him because a couple of years ago, Donald Trump said, "Oh, yes, Frederick Douglass. I know him. He's doing great things." And everyone was like, "Man, Frederick Douglass has been dead for 150 years." But who knows what's going on with that. Um, anyway, Donald Trump aside, Frederick Douglass is born in 1818. He is born enslaved in Maryland. He escapes slavery eventually in 1838 and he moves to the northern United States. He becomes a very well-known abolitionist, an orator, and one of the most famous names in the United States in this period, and soon to be the Atlantic world more broadly. Like those other Black abolitionists I mentioned before, he too publishes an autobiography of his time enslaved as an adolescent, as a child. And this is published to great acclaim throughout the United States and throughout Britain. And so eventually he decides to undertake a lecture tour to Britain in 1845, which will be the first of many trips across the Atlantic. So he arrives in August 1845, and what I want to use him to demonstrate, his experiences to demonstrate, is the fact that American abolitionists in Britain found themselves in an atmosphere that they found to be very racially tolerant, right? This is a new experience for them. Racially tolerant to a certain extent. This is not to say that there is not racism underlying in 19th century England, but compared to the United States, where they're coming from, where they're being persecuted, enslaved, Black abolitionists in Britain find they can kind of breathe freely, this fresh, free, anti-slavery air that they haven't felt before. And so he, despite the fact that he actually faces some hostility on the ship over to England, he quickly found what he, uses quotes, monarchical Britain to be far more tolerant than his home country. And so, sorry, this is a long excerpt. I won't read the whole thing, but I'll just pick out a couple of points. So he says in his second autobiography that he publishes in 1855, he talks about his feelings about his time spent in England. And so he says he has, quote, spent some of the happiest moments of my life since landing in this country. I seem to have undergone a transformation. I live a new life. The warm and generous cooperation extended to me by the friends of my despised race, etc., etc. The entire absence of everything that looked like prejudice against me on account of the color of my skin contrasted so strongly with my long and bitter experience in the United States. And so this type of, I guess we could call it a mild Anglophilia, becomes a major part of his lectures in Britain. So he goes on these lecture tours all throughout the British Isles. But there's this interesting kind of tension because many of these black abolitionists will praise that they feel this racial tolerance that they haven't felt before, right? But they will still, at some points, push Britain on the fact that they are still, for example, exporting cotton from the South, right? So in some ways, still promulgating sorry, they've abolished slavery, but they're still supporting it in some indirect ways. And so he, like I said before, he escaped slavery when he was a young man. When he's in England, he actually finds some supporters in the Richardson family in Newcastle, and they actually decide to raise enough money so that Frederick Douglass can purchase his freedom back in the United States to avoid any sort of potential re-enslavement that does occur. But it's an interesting question because one scholar whose work I'm in a big admiration of is Hannah Rose Murray. And she talks a lot about how some Garrisonian abolitionists didn't think that it was even, if you were to pay for your freedom, you're sort of sanctioning the fact that they thought humans were property. And so there's a little bit of tension here between Frederick Douglass and some Garrisonians. He is a Garrisonian in that early phase of his abolitionist career during his first trip to England, but eventually he will move away from Garrison and, he changes his approach to the movement basically. But the way he talks about England is just very representative of these tensions and kind of nuances in this movement. A similar kind of story here is Sarah Parker Remond. She is born a little bit later. She's born in 1826, and she is actually born not enslaved, but born to a free family in Salem, in Massachusetts. And this is a relatively affluent Black family living in the suburbs of Massachusetts. And she is brought up in a very, anti-slavery home. Her brother Charles is one of the first Black abolitionists to travel to England in the 1840s. And he, makes a huge splash, does a great job, and really, is a trailblazer in many ways. And Sarah will join him in that lecture tour role in 1859. So she travels to England in 1859, and she has a kind of similar experience to Frederick Douglass, where she feels this new sense of racial tolerance, in some ways, but in other ways, not. So basically, she decides that she wants to go to Paris while she's in England. So she applies for a passport. However, the US Embassy denies that because they say actually to have a passport, you have to be a citizen. And they suggest that she, as a woman of African descent, as per the American law, which is enshrined in the Supreme Court with a decision made in 1857 that Black Americans were not citizens, she's denied that passport. So she is still facing this kind of institutionalized racism of this transatlantic sphere. I guess to avoid that happening again, a few years later, she decides to apply for British citizenship. So she sends this letter in, and again, she, similar to Frederick Douglass, uses this as an opportunity to praise Britain and highlight the hypocrisy of the United States. And so, again, I have this little excerpt here. She writes in her application that she has, quote, adopted England as her country. And the reason she is doing this is because the strong prejudice against persons of African descent, which is entertained by a large proportion of the inhabitants of the United States, have deterred her from wanting to return to America. So she's saying, my friends are here, my life is here. I don't want to go back to America because I'm just going to be, you know, discriminated against because of my the color of my skin. And so it's kind of this interesting dichotomy once again. She does actually move to Florence, however, in 1866, where she becomes a physician and is there until she passes away a couple of decades later. So she's a very interesting woman, and I wish I could spend a bit more time on her. But I want to spend I don't have that long, so I'm going to go quickly. The next little bit on this man here, whose name is Samuel Ringgold Ward. And he is a name you probably won't have heard of. I hadn't heard of him either before I started my PhD thesis. But he is similar to Frederick Douglass. He is born enslaved in Maryland in the early 1800s. He, similar to Douglass, also escapes, but at a younger age. And he is very well known, again, like Douglass, for his oratory. Becomes a very famous public speaker, an anti-slavery speaker. And he also travels to England. He is there from 1853 until about 1855. So these are really long lecture tours. They're there for years on end, traveling to dozens and dozens of cities and towns. But there's an interesting distinction between these two men, and that is they were perceived differently by British audiences because of their different complexions. So Samuel Ward on the left, people noted him as being very dark, very black in complexion, whereas Frederick Douglass was of lighter complexion. And so what's really interesting to note when we look at these two men going to England, doing these public tours, is just how much focus there is on Samuel Ward's skin color. So one report published while he was on a lecture tour, they suggest that, oh no, sorry, I've lost it. Oh, yes, sorry. In Reading in November 1854, one of the newspapers depicted Ward as, quote, a man of pleasing exterior, of great muscular power, and judging from the large compass of his voice, of stentorian lungs. They described him as, quote, intensely black, tall, erect, and muscular, moving with the easy grace of a panther. So there's kind of this admiration, but also this, kind of racism in the way that they're describing him. But it all kind of is this fascination with, black bodies up on stage delivering these lectures. And so Ward is really interesting because he's able to penetrate the British society really quite deeply and in a way that shows those points I made before, that Black abolitionists were able to circulate in this kind of upper class British society in a way that they never could have back in the United States. And so Ward in particular forms very close connections with the Earl of Shaftesbury, the Duchess of Sutherland. He's going to parties at their houses. He speaks about one night where he went to a party at Stafford House. On his arm was Harriet Beecher Stowe, who is the author of Uncle Tom's Cabin. Interestingly enough, though, Harriet Beecher Stowe, although she is this anti-slavery icon, her recollection of this event that she publishes, she suggests that Ward was there kind of in the corner. She totally negates the fact that she had gone in on his arm. And again, this is sort of speaking to this tension of the fact that, anti-slavery activists were not always necessarily pro-equality, right? It's the two things are not always one and the same. For many abolitionists, they were, but some abolitionists were a little bit more conservative, a little bit less pro-black, sort of in that sense. Um, Very quickly, what I'm going to do is, what time is it? Yeah, okay. Tell you one situation that um, shows this real tension between white and black abolitionists, but also Garrison and non-Garrisonian abolitionists. Um, Basically, you have Garrisonian abolitionists, sorry, it gets very confusing. Garrisonian abolitionists in Britain fundraising money for their societies. And then you have men like Samuel Ward who are fundraising for their societies. So Samuel Ward is a non-Garrisonian. He's a supporter of political abolitionism. He is actually raising money for the Anti-Slavery Society of Canada. And he and a bunch of other abolitionists are accused of kind of taking what should be money for traditional Garrisonian recipients. And so this man here, Parker Pillsbury, on the left-hand side, he is very critical of men like Ward and some of his colleagues who are raising money for different things. So he says, quote, "Not one of these men, as far as I can learn, ever pretended to be doing anything for the anti-slavery cause by his mission abroad. It was all fugitives in Canada or vigilance committees, fugitives in Canada being a reference to Samuel Ward's fundraising goal." And then he made this comment as well that no pay, parish, or plantation could seduce a real abolitionist who would take reward in his work. This, again, is a swipe at Samuel Ward, who did accept a piece of land from a man, a British man in Jamaica. So he's basically saying, if you're a real abolitionist, you wouldn't take any money for this work, you wouldn't accept any land. But of course, the fact that it's a white abolitionist saying these things about black abolitionists, this idea of what's a real abolitionist, et cetera, is speaking to this kind of underlying racial paternalism that we see in a lot of transatlantic abolitionist circles in this time. And so naturally, Samuel Ward hits back at this white abolitionist. He says, quote, "that were we abolitionists, we should neither settle over parishes nor upon plantations. I ask once more, is this not the animus of the overseer? Is it at all akin to the idea that a black person is so equal to an Anglo-Saxon that he may go where he pleases, move his own field and method of labor, and succeed as well as he can? No. The chief complaint against us that we do succeed and possibly may do yet more." The key line here is this one here. Is this not the animus of the overseer? An overseer was a kind of like a manager on a plantation, right? Making the enslaved people, making sure they're working. So he is basically saying, you're acting like a slave owner or a slave driver, a slave overseer. and pushing back against this and saying that, you can't decide how free black people, black abolitionists go about their business. Um, and yeah, sort of just speaks to this tension that we see between a lot of black abolitionists and white abolitionists, particularly in the British context, when they're traveling and kind of navigating this new scene. Um, what is really interesting because we don't know much about his later life. He moves to Jamaica. As I mentioned before, he's given some land. Um, about 10 years after he moves to Jamaica, there is the Morant Bay Rebellion, where there's a big uprising that is forcibly suppressed by the British militia. And surprisingly, Ward is really fascinating because he's obviously this big anti-slavery advocate, but he actually comes out and writes this pamphlet in favor of the British militia who put down this rebellion in Jamaica, where he lives. He basically dies in obscurity. He was a man that, rivaled Frederick Douglass in his day, but who no one really knows much about now. Until recently, he was very understudied by historians. Until a couple of years ago, a wonderful historian named Richard Blackett published a biography of Ward, noting how hard it had been to pick all these different pieces up to create this story, but doing an excellent job in doing so. Um, he made an important contribution to anti-slavery in Britain, just like Frederick Douglass, just like Sarah Parker Remond, just like many, many Black abolitionists that traveled across the Atlantic in this period. And yeah, I should make the point that if you are interested in more about this, I will plug my own book, but Hannah Rose Murray's book, she's a British historian. Her book is called Advocates of Freedom. It's a really, really great book about Black abolitionists in Britain. My own book is coming out with Louisiana State Press. Who knows when? But I'm kind of working on specifically the intimate relationships between like husbands and wives, mothers and children, fathers and children, brothers and sisters, and how those relationships influence the development of people's anti-slavery ideologies and behavior and that sort of thing. So I can't really plug that yet because I'm still working on the manuscript, but hopefully I'll have that in soon. But yeah, thank you so much. I might leave it there. Stop share.